On the evening of August 27, 2023, on Interstate 10 in the state of Arizona, Officer Brown experienced one of the most bizarre and memorable traffic stops of his career. A Hyundai Sonata sped down the highway at over 90 miles per hour, far exceeding the 65 miles per hour speed limit. What made the situation even stranger was not just the speed, but the fact that all the car's windows were covered with bright pink blankets, as though the driver was attempting to turn the car into a mobile secret fortress. What followed was a series of dramatic, humorous, and somewhat satirical events that made this stop the most insufferable traffic stop ever, one that anyone who heard about it would likely laugh at. Officer Brown, a seasoned police officer with years of experience and a reputation for staying calm under pressure, couldn't help but feel something was amiss as he watched the Hyundai Sonata speeding down the freeway. Not wanting to miss the opportunity to stop a clear case of speeding, he immediately activated his PA system, and his voice echoed across the roadway, "Open the car door, put your hands out immediately." However, instead of receiving the cooperation he had hoped for, Brown was faced with a truly bizarre scene. The Sonata wasn't just speeding as if trying to outrun every traffic law, it had a peculiar feature that left Brown scratching his head. All of the car's windows were covered with bright pink blankets. These weren't just ordinary blankets, they looked like some sort of eccentric accessory designed to create a mobile fortress. Nothing about this scene made sense, just pure oddity. The sight left Brown stunned, and he found himself wondering, do people use blankets to block UV rays now? This is unbelievable. The car and driver seemed to be sending an odd message. This wasn't just a speed chase, but an impromptu display of eccentricity in a world already chaotic enough with traffic laws. Brown's confusion grew when he realized that beyond the speeding violation, this car hid an enigma that made him doubt everything he thought he knew. Was this some sort of cover-up tactic, or was it simply a weird habit the driver had chosen to highlight her car in a rather unconventional way? Brown couldn't help but wonder, if only for a fleeting moment, if blankets had now become a means of shielding oneself from the sun instead of just keeping warm in the winter. These strange questions only served to make an already tense situation more bizarre and even humorous, a touch of irreverence in the daily grind of a police officer's job. In response to Officer Brown's stern command, a surprisingly graceful gesture emerged from the narrow window crack. Instead of complying or at least showing some respect, a hand slowly appeared, not in a gesture of cooperation or apology, but to give him a very elegant middle finger. This act wasn't just a reckless outburst, it was a blatant challenge to the authority of the law. Brown, used to countless tense and sometimes absurd situations, could only stand there in shock, unable to believe his eyes. It was as if he couldn't tell whether he was making a serious traffic stop or accidentally starring in a live sitcom. The sense of bewilderment was so strong that Brown had to shake his head, wondering if this was a bizarre joke or an inexplicable challenge he couldn't quite grasp. The scene not only amazed him but also made him feel as though he was the unwitting lead in a farce, one he couldn't stop laughing at, if not for the gravity of the situation. From inside the car came the voice of a woman, but not the typical response. Her voice was sharp and garbled, like a radio signal filled with static. Her words, "I can't hear you. What are you saying?" blared through the loudspeaker, making Officer Brown feel as though he were caught in a terrible prank. Her voice was clipped and unclear, as if she were deliberately turning communication into an insurmountable challenge. It wasn't a passive or timid response, it was outright defiance, as though she were testing his patience. Officer Brown couldn't help but furrow his brow, a clear sign of both surprise and frustration. He sighed, growing weary of the unfolding situation. A sense of disappointment crept into his mind as he questioned, is she really not hearing me through the PA system, or is she just putting on some cheap act to waste time? He could feel the ambiguity of the situation, as if what was happening wasn't just a failed communication, but a challenge to his patience and control. For a moment, Brown wondered if he had chosen the wrong career. It felt like he had stepped into an endless play, where every instruction he gave was met with bizarre behavior he couldn't explain. While the situation had some comedic elements, it also brought with it a deep sense of frustration with the driver's lack of cooperation and disregard for the law. Deep down, he began to question whether she genuinely couldn't hear him, or if she was simply taking every opportunity to complicate matters further, creating an unpredictable challenge. The sense of being unreachable from outside the car, combined with the strange performance coming from the woman inside, made Brown feel like an unwanted extra in a theatrical production. He could sense the absurdity of the situation. His commands were being broadcast clearly, yet all he received in return was constant defiance from her. This made him question the practicality of trying to communicate in such a situation. The woman's resistance, though somewhat surprising, only added to the strange and humorous nature of the scenario, but it also made him start to question his own ability to handle the job. However, this strange behavior was just the beginning of an incredible and unpredictable series of events that would turn this traffic stop into not only a true test of patience but also a trial of Officer Brown's ability to stay calm and composed. Things began to spiral out of control as the driver not only refused to cooperate but also made increasingly blatant and challenging moves, forcing Brown to realize that this wasn't just a simple traffic violation, it was something far more serious. With no other choice, Brown was forced to make a bold decision and escalate the situation into a felony stop. This is a measure not only to protect his own safety but also to prevent any potential risks that could arise from the driver's actions. Brown's voice through the PA system now grew cold and authoritative, no longer a series of gentle reminders. Every word he spoke was a stern warning, emphasizing that this was the last chance, a moment not to be missed. Last chance, open the door and step out of the vehicle. This is an order. His words were not just an assertion of authority but a display of unwavering determination, making it clear that there would be no leniency in this situation. This only heightened the tension that enveloped the air, as every decision and every move could lead to serious consequences. However, even as the tension mounted, Brown didn't let his frustration dictate his actions. He maintained control and wielded his power strategically, aiming to avoid turning the situation into even more chaos. This moment tested his composure and raised the question of how one handles extreme situations in a job that few could imagine. Despite numerous stern warnings from Officer Brown, the Hyundai Sonata remained motionless, like a fortress, unmoving. At that point, the car was not just a vehicle, it was a symbol of resilience, stubbornly resisting any form of pressure. Officer Brown, with no other options left, continued issuing commands through the loudspeaker, but the vehicle stayed still, showing no signs that the driver intended to comply. The long minutes seemed to challenge both sides. The officer had to remain patient while the occupant of the car stood resolute, refusing to budge. Finally, after a long period of tension, the car door emitted a heavy creak, as if even the door was protesting its forced opening in this situation. The scene was almost like a dark comedy, as it felt like both the car and its door were being compelled to act unwillingly. But what really surprised Officer Brown wasn't the fact that the door had opened, but the driver's reaction afterward. Instead of stepping out and complying with the order, the woman inside remained seated, motionless, her arms crossed defiantly. Her eyes were not filled with fear or confusion, instead, they exuded arrogance and calculation. It was the gaze of someone contemplating whether to make Officer Brown break the car door open and invite her out unwillingly. She seemed to have decided that she could turn this situation into a battle of power, adopting an unyielding attitude, as if playing a tense game of chess, carefully considering her next move. All these details, from the creaking car door to the driver's haughty gaze and attitude, didn't just make the situation more dramatic, they forced Officer Brown to face a scenario that required not just skill in handling the situation but also patience and tact when dealing with a person who was not easily subdued. When she spoke, her voice was filled with confidence and determination, as if every word she uttered was an undeniable declaration, "I don't need to step out, and you have no right to force me." Each word she spoke felt like a decree, radiating absolute decisiveness and confidence, making the surrounding space suddenly fall silent, as if the entire universe had to pause to admire the strength in her every syllable. She wasn't just refusing the officer's command, she was challenging both authority and the law. Although it was just a simple traffic violation, she seemed to see herself as the protagonist in a play, where everything revolved around her existence. Faced with this, Officer Brown could only sigh, feeling trapped in a dark comedy with no way to escape. In his mind, the question kept turning: was he dealing with a mere traffic violation, or was he actually part of a dialogue with the main character in a tragicomedy, where everything was turned upside down and the usual rules no longer applied? He felt as though he was being pulled into a joke he didn't fully understand, while the driver seemed to be standing center stage, brimming with self-assurance and an unshakable attitude. On the side of law enforcement, Officer Brown represented not just the power of the law but also the embodiment of patience and composure in handling this complex situation. He understood that every action, every word, and every gesture could either escalate the tension or provoke an unpredictable reaction. The police officer was not just an enforcer of the law, he was also the one controlling the situation, knowing how to suppress his anger and frustration when facing a defiant violator. On the other hand, the woman, with her unyielding stubbornness and arrogant attitude, had no intention of yielding to the power of the law. Not only was she ignoring the legal orders given to her, but she also displayed a sense of disdain, as if she had the right to make the decisions and become the center of attention. She was not just violating traffic laws but was challenging the very principles of respect and cooperation between the public and law enforcement. The confrontation between these two sides was not just a struggle for power but also a test of intellect and adaptability. Brown knew that if he wasn't careful, this situation could quickly turn into an unwanted spectacle, where justice and reason were thrown aside in favor of chaotic and uncontrollable banter. The police officer had to ensure that he maintained his authority without losing professionalism, preventing his actions from becoming a source of mockery for others. Thus, this passage isn't just about the clash between law and violation, it also highlights the tension between intellect and emotion, between power and resistance. This battle of wits would ultimately be decided not just by Brown's patience and authority, but by his ability to handle the tense moments, where a single mistake could turn this story into a highly unpredictable scenario. When Brown finally decided to approach the car directly, the scene inside was almost like a darkly comedic film. In the back seat, a young girl, about 5 years old, sat calmly, holding a half-eaten lollipop, her wide eyes sparkling as if she were watching the most thrilling blockbuster of her life. Her expression seemed to suggest that this was not a dangerous situation, but just a regular evening of entertainment. However, the calmness of the little girl was in stark contrast to the overpowering smell of alcohol emanating from the driver's seat. Brown grimaced slightly, leaned closer to the car window, and asked, his voice both serious and patient, "How much have you had to drink?" The driver, a woman with a face as red as a ripe tomato, turned and replied, showing no shame or remorse. Her eyes glowed with a provocative gleam, "I drank orange juice." "What, have you never seen anyone get drunk on orange juice?" Brown straightened up, taking a few seconds to process her answer. He thought to himself, orange juice can be a healthy drink, but it's certainly not something that smells like hard liquor. The driver seemed oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, or perhaps she was simply too confident in her own creative abilities. With a self-satisfied look on her face, she leaned back in her seat as if she had just given the perfect answer, challenging all logic and reason. Meanwhile, Officer Brown glanced at the little girl in the back seat. She seemed to be accustomed to her mother's eccentricities, as instead of being scared, she calmly licked her candy, her eyes lazily staring out the window, as though wondering how much longer this fun would last. At this point, the situation became crystal clear. Not only was the woman intoxicated, but she also had an excessive confidence that made Officer Brown feel both frustrated and slightly amused. But with his experience, he knew that all mockery had to be set aside, because in this car, a young child was being caught up in the chaos she didn't deserve. As Officer Brown moved closer to perform the handcuffing, the driver's spectacular performance officially began. With a surprisingly nimble flexibility, she twisted and turned like a dancer performing a reverse pirouette, avoiding every attempt the officer made to subdue her. While pulling her arms away from his reach, she yelled, "I'm not resisting. But I don't agree with being arrested." This paradoxical statement left Brown momentarily stunned. He paused, tilting his head as though trying to process whether he had heard it right. After a few seconds, he regained his composure and, calmly yet firmly, said, "Whether you agree or not doesn't matter. I have pepper spray and a taser. Want to try it?" But instead of showing fear or cooperating, the driver just flashed a smug smile. She stood up straight, crossed her arms, and nonchalantly responded with a challenging tone, "Go ahead. I'll sue you into bankruptcy. You'll never be able to pay for it." Her bold threat caused those around, including a few other officers who had arrived to assist, to stifle their laughter. It seemed she didn't realize that, to Officer Brown, this wasn't a legal debate, but a public safety matter. Her bold threat caused those around, including a few other officers who had arrived to assist, to stifle their laughter. It seemed she didn't realize that, to Officer Brown, this wasn't a legal debate, but a public safety matter. The entire ordeal stretched on for several minutes, turning the arrest into a highway comedy show. Meanwhile, the young daughter in the car just sighed, shaking her head in exasperation, as though she was already used to her mother's dramatic antics. The driver's persistent resistance finally came to an end when Brown and a colleague worked together to successfully handcuff her. But not before she shouted one last defiant remark, "You won this time, but I'll be back. Just wait." That was the moment Brown realized that sometimes law enforcement requires not just firmness and professional skill, but also a strong spirit to handle one-of-a-kind individuals like her, in the midst of the tense traffic stop. A small voice from the back seat suddenly broke the seriousness of the situation. "Excuse me, officer, is my mom going to be arrested for long? I'm hungry." The innocent question from the little girl, the only one in this situation who truly didn't understand the gravity of what was happening, made Officer Brown pause. He turned to look at her through the car window, his expression kind yet tinged with concern. As a father, he knew that this child didn't deserve to bear the consequences of her mother's recklessness and defiance. Brown crouched down, his tone softening as he tried to reassure the girl, "We'll get you something to eat soon, but right now, your mom needs to understand that what she's doing isn't safe." In that moment, he was no longer just a law enforcement officer, but a grown-up trying to protect a child from the chaos created by adults. He quickly grabbed his radio, requesting his team to check on the child's welfare. This not only showed Brown's responsibility toward the girl but also highlighted the humanity with which he handled this challenging situation. The little girl's words, though brief, carried the weight of childhood innocence and carefree spirit, sharply contrasting with her mother's baffling behavior. Not only did it help ease the tension of the situation, but it also served as a poignant reminder of the consequences of thoughtless actions by adults, as not only they but also innocent children are affected. Brown's response was a remarkable blend of humor and calmness, skillfully balancing sarcasm with a level-headed approach in the midst of an escalating situation. Faced with a combative and increasingly erratic driver, Brown could have easily allowed his frustration to show, but instead, he took a step back and saw the absurdity of her words. His threat, which could have come across as an insult to others, was delivered with a tone of playful irony, as if he had already written off her comments as part of an absurd performance. He seemed to recognize that, in the grand scheme of things, engaging in a battle of insults with the driver would only fuel her defiance, rather than resolve the tension. By deflecting the hostility with sarcasm, Brown not only maintained his composure but subtly shifted the tone of the encounter, transforming it from an intense standoff into a moment of levity amidst the chaos. The driver, on the other hand, failed to grasp the irony of the situation. Her cursing and incessant muttering about the injustice of the system and the misfortune of police officers painted her as someone determined to position herself as the victim, despite her blatant disregard for the law. In her mind, her stubbornness and erratic behavior were justified, but she didn't seem to recognize that these actions were only exacerbating the problem. Each incomprehensible rant, each refusal to cooperate, only served to deepen the tension and draw out the inevitable escalation. Rather than take a moment to reflect on her actions, the driver continued to spiral, trapped in her own narrative of victimhood. Which ironically kept her from seeing the root cause of the situation, her own refusal to comply with basic instructions. Had she acknowledged her part in the unfolding drama, the situation could have de-escalated much sooner, but instead, her defiance remained a self-perpetuating cycle. In that moment, Brown couldn't help but notice the little girl sitting quietly in the car, her eyes glowing with innocent curiosity, as if the world around her had no relevance. Holding a lollipop in her hand, she was so focused that she didn't even notice the chaos unfolding around her. This scene, a small child engaged in such a simple act, stood in stark contrast to her mother who was causing a ruckus and defiantly resisting every command, leaving Brown with a strange sense of unease. He silently thought to himself, I hope she doesn't grow up to be like her mother. It wasn't just a passing thought, it was a question about how the next generation could be shaped by the actions and choices of those before them. While the mother continuously argued and defied the officer's instructions, the little girl remained the picture of innocence and serenity, completely unaffected by the anger her mother was displaying. The stark contrast between the two generations, one full of agitation and stubbornness, and the other full of naivete and silence, created an ironic and almost bitterly humorous image. This made the situation even more tragic and unforgettable. Officer Brown couldn't help but wonder whether the mother's actions would leave a lasting mark on the little girl's development. Would the girl learn patience, respect for the law, and composure from such situations, or would she be swept up in the defiance and rebellion her mother was exhibiting? It was a question with no easy answer, but one that would certainly remain etched in Brown's mind, causing him to reflect on the long-term impact that adult behavior and role models can have on the younger generation. As Officer Brown carefully read the Miranda rights, his voice carried an impressive patience, similar to a teacher trying to explain a lesson to a stubborn student. However, instead of showing remorse or listening quietly, the driver, still maintaining her arrogance and defiant attitude, interrupted, saying, "You think you're so clever? I'll represent myself and win this case." Her challenge, laced with ignorance of the law, made both Brown and his supporting colleagues struggle to hold back their laughter. She seemed to believe that self-defense would be her best strategy, despite the overwhelming evidence against her, from driving under the influence, speeding, to her refusal to cooperate. Brown, maintaining his composure, raised an eyebrow and calmly asked, "So, you'll represent yourself in court, even while handcuffed?" She retorted, with a biting tone, "Yes. Just wait and see, I'll sue you for disturbing my sleep." The contradiction in the driver's words made the situation both ridiculous and exasperating. Brown stayed calm, but secretly thought, if she put this energy into studying real law, maybe things would be different. This moment not only reflected the absurd arrogance of some lawbreakers but also stood as a clear testament to the professionalism of the police when handling both humorous and tense situations. Despite being constrained by rules, Brown skillfully balanced maintaining order while suppressing his laughter. The driver, after being arrested and placed in the patrol car, continued to complain and criticize the police. Her words, "You police officers are ruining the world. Nobody likes you," were not only an unreasonable criticism but also reflected her baseless frustration, as she saw herself as a victim in a situation clearly caused by her own actions. This is a typical response from those who refuse to face the truth, blaming others instead of reflecting on their own behavior. Her resistance made her even less convincing, yet it highlighted an important aspect. Even in a situation where she was being arrested, she still clung to the belief that others were at fault, failing to recognize her own mistakes. From her words, it was clear she was trying to blame society, the police, even the world around her, to justify her actions. In response, Officer Brown, with a weary yet composed expression, sighed and gently said, "Don't be like your mom. I think she needs a long day to think things through." This response not only displayed his patience but also served as a subtle lesson, advising the driver not to let her daughter learn from her wrongful behavior. Brown's words were a reminder, not just to the driver, but to everyone, that every action has consequences, especially for the younger generation. Brown's statement also demonstrated his understanding of the situation. While the driver was trying to protect her ego and was oblivious to her own faults, the little girl in the car was innocent and needed to be protected and taught the right way. This created a sharp contrast between the mother's selfishness and stubbornness and the officer's wisdom and tact. In conclusion, this traffic stop was not only a humorous situation but also a lesson in patience, responsibility, and societal attitudes. Despite facing an uncooperative violator, Officer Brown maintained composure and upheld his principles. He not only carried out his duty professionally but also conveyed a message about the importance of setting a good example for future generations, as the wrongdoings of adults can deeply impact innocent children. The lesson is, each of us, regardless of our position in society, has a responsibility to act correctly, especially toward the next generation. In life, patience and tact in handling tense situations not only help resolve issues but also create positive changes in the surrounding community.